Welcome to Never Rewrite. I'm Isaac Askew.
Dustin Rea.
And I'm Jeffrey Sherman. And today we're going to talk about the impact and costs of hidden business rules. So, Dustin, you brought this idea up of when you have business rules, especially if they're complicated or change after they get first contact with customers, which ideally as early as possible, but especially on long-lived features that have gone through many developers over many years, you're going to have things that are not documented and quite possibly inconsistent in different parts of your code base.
Mhm.
And this is going to be a very expensive problem. You want to take it away, explain how?
Yeah, and I've seen this at all stages of the business. So whether you are a non-technical founder delivering instructions to an AI and vibe coding, or whether you are the same person delivering instructions to a human developer team, or you are a product manager working with an engineering team at an organization, I've seen the same problems. And essentially the problem is something like if you're essentially fixing the same core issues all of the time, or you feel like there's a constant disconnect between what you're asking for and like what the engineers are delivering, maybe not in the initial delivery, but like over time,
Mm-hmm.
you'll hear. So like as a product owner, you may think like, oh, that was obvious. Why didn't you like think of that? And so some of that comes down to it's not necessarily obvious. Sometimes what's happening is engineers are making assumptions. And then those assumptions can cost the business later. There's not a malicious intent by it,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just the nature of the business. So essentially, the problem is the more that you have to rework a particular feature due to either engineering mistake or product mistake or just changes due to feedback, the more rework put into that and the more time spent on that feature, essentially, that's the more expensive it is to deliver to the customer, and will also balloon your time. So if you find that your engineering timelines are constantly ballooning, or the costs are ballooning with them, like unexpectedly, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of that is due to that kind of churn. Where it's like, well, it was supposed to do this, and now it needs to do this, and I didn't think about the case where these both need to live together in the same system. Or other cases are where, hey, we want to take this functionality that's over here in this part of the UI, and we want it to also appear in this part of the UI, but we want the data source to be the same, right? And so that's like those are kind of the places that I see these kinds of problems hidden most
Mm-hmm.
often. Is we want to make sure that everyone has the same understanding of those components. So let's take a few examples, right? So some
Well,
of these rules. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, why don't I bring in a concrete example for the
Yeah, yeah,
listener?
yeah. Perfect.
So, right in my day job, I actually encountered this exact problem where the company I'm with, they've got a config table, and right, it's just as simple of, hey, this key, here's a value, and this is configuration, general config table, nothing special. Except the config table also has the ability to have user ID equals 0, which makes it a global value, or there's a specific user ID, which makes it a user specific setting for that user customer. And some of the, or almost every usage of it is for the global value. And some of the implementations don't even realize that there is a user specific value, and they only rely on the default. They don't even acknowledge the user ID column. And so they rely on the default, which is global. And the developer appears to have been entirely unaware of the other options that they've accidentally entirely excised, with the result of, hey, some of this data, some of these functions may not return you the data that you expect. If you have a field that you expect to have one value because it's global, and all of a sudden there's 100 values because it's actually set per user, and you ask for it without specifying which user, non-deterministic answer.
Right.
MySQL will usually give you back the same row, but not necessarily. There's no guarantee on that. And then to make it further enticing, at some point in some of the implementations a decade earlier, I guess things had gotten out of control. Again, developers are gone, so I have no one to ask. But they added
Hmm.
a whitelist. So only certain values could be added to the configuration thing, and you couldn't just add anything willy nilly. You look at that code and you're like, oh, obvious, you can get a good guess of what was going on, but only some of the implementations have that whitelist check. And so as a
Right.
result, you can create a config value using one entry code path, and you cannot retrieve it using a different one because it's not in the whitelist. And
Mm.
also, you may or may not get the one you want based on the user ID. And here you have well intentioned people over 12 years or so going back through the Git commits, and you've got 3 or 4 different implementations of the same thing. So, Dustin, how do I get at, or how do I prevent this? And then if I'm in this, how do I fix it?
Yeah, so with the when you have like four implementations too of the same thing, this is like a common instance. Like the way that I see this happen from the business perspective is that, like I said, kind of like over time, different people have, different product managers or different people within the organization have requested these things to happen in different places in the
Mm-hmm.
product or the application. And then so without, like you said, if certain people that originally wrote those implementations have now left and there's no place that the rules of that implementation are documented, meaning you would essentially have to do detective work in the code base to understand what the current rules are.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as you don't know if those were the intentional rules at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So you would need to then validate that with a product person. So all of these things that I'm describing, as you can imagine, this is a cost to the business. Just for you to get started, on kind of your next thing is to understand these things, and it just builds up over time and compounds. So kind of the solution to it is to have the business rules at least written in some place, and not a short-term place. So not something like a PRD or a ticket, because PRDs, in my experience, don't survive customer feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to get the initial implementation. You may nail all of those rules and even have all of those in automated tests so they don't change. But that doesn't mean that the next person working on it or the next place that it gets implemented will have that full understanding. Um,
Right. That was going to be my first thing because I know the traditional snotty answer is, well, the code is the rules, and you should look in the code. But in my case, I've got various implementations where developers didn't look at the code, didn't look at what was
right.
done before, and they did a new implementation with new rules, sort of willy nilly. So
Mhm.
clearly you can't say the code is the documentation.
Correct. Yeah, I have and I've heard this same argument in companies that I've worked in and in client organizations as well. That hey, well, I'll just go look at the code. And I think my argument against that, I'll kind of tell a story and kind of explain it as well. But in the game design industry, we were talking about this before the call. In the game design industry, what programmers do is they give kind of a control panel to the game designer. And usually the game designer can be a technical person, but they don't have to be. And the point is that the the developer is not necessarily the one deciding the rules of the game. That's the game designer's job, right? And so I kind of bring that same analogy to say I think in software we should start to think about even business to business software in the same way, because we all work with product management organizations within our own organization. So it's like always a kind of tech and product collaboration. And so I think that's kind of what we want to start to aim towards, is that we don't want the product person or even the designer to have to go in and read the code to understand what the rules of the business and the product are. Because if they want to start to create new concepts or iterations on the current concepts, they essentially need to have a manifest of what the rules are. Because I've seen a lot of cycles wasted when people make like version 2 and version 3s of UIs that now don't account for functionality that
Mm.
you don't
Mm-hmm.
notice on the surface. And it's like, well, then how do we handle these 17 other things that we need to do? And it's like, oh, I didn't think about that. And so for the business, what I see is the risk there is you're depending on people to just catch that difference,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very difficult to do, especially if you weren't the original author and you didn't just get done writing it. Like even your own work. Sometimes I go back to my own work and I'm like, I wrote this. I don't remember writing any of this. So yeah, I mean, it's just hard to kind of keep everything in your memory. So the business wants to essentially de-risk that kind of interaction.
This kind of goes back to the rewrite problem too. where when someone's trying to pitch a rewrite and they think it's going to be easy because they're like, oh, the other ones, your legacy system's so confusing here, let's just rewrite it to make it the rules cleaner or whatever, this logic kind of behave as we
Mm-hmm.
expect without having that understanding. That's when they go in there and once they try to do this rewrite, they'll see all those different edge cases and they go, oh, this is a lot trickier than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be simple. And that's the inverted way of approaching it. So it aligns the same way in that you still want to have the today's business requirements of what this thing should be doing, because maybe one, you don't need to port over all that functionality. You can change it depending on new product requirements, and so you're porting over antiquated edge cases that you don't need to account for anymore, or essentially rewriting the bad code in a new
Mm-hmm.
language or an up-to-date language, right? But it all kind of still comes from the lack of understanding of what you're touching and what the thing is
Mm-hmm.
supposed to do. So I feel like that kind of tackles two problems there, and that information will help guide the developer better.
Right. In my example, I looked at all this code and I was like, oh, well, maybe I can start merging all of these implementations into one. And then I looked at them like, well, no, they're actually, some of them are fundamentally
Mm-hmm.
disagree on functionality. Like this, there's a whitelist. Some of the code uses it, some of it doesn't. Do I keep the whitelist or do I ditch the whitelist? If I had to do both, then I would need to put in, if I was to do a rewrite and had to keep both, like, okay, well, if it comes through this, then
Right.
there'd be like a Boolean flag. Is this part of the whitelist check?
Yeah.
It'd be madness.
Right, and then from the business perspective, imagine there's essentially customers of the business that are having two different experiences depending on where they interact with that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very likely in my experience and even like my own personal app behavior is that once I find the path that gets the work done that I want to get done, that's the path I'm taking every time.
Mm-hmm.
So I can imagine that there's people that even are doing what they think is the same workflow and getting different results and still being okay with those results. So if you make a change, you've now actually disrupted somebody's workflow, even though you're
Mm-hmm.
trying to make an improvement and consolidate. So like all of those, when you have a
Mm-hmm.
living, breathing product and customers using it, all of those decisions kind of have to, come into play. And the sooner you have all of those decisions consolidated in your life cycle, the easier it is to just kind of scale more quickly because you don't lose all of these cycles in the rework.
Okay. So how do you get this rule set? How do you convince people to do it, and how do you convince people to actually look at it before doing new work? Because that's the
Yeah,
second part. I think is the hard part.
the second part is the hard part. You're exactly right, and it is difficult. There's a tactical approach to what I call the product book or the internal product book, just for clarity. But this is a product book that is not necessarily meant to be externally facing.
Mm-hmm.
It's for the internal team to use. And in my experience and in my opinion, it should be versioned in the exact same way as the software. And so you would have, when you have a new release coming out of the software, any of those rules that need to change in the product book, you would just essentially version the pages of the product book that have, been updated, so that you kind of always have this picture and historic reference. So we've mentioned tribal knowledge before, and I don't remember if we mentioned it on this call, but the goal here is to again get away from tribal knowledge of where all of the people contain the knowledge in their shared kind of consciousness. And we want to just dump that into a kind of written format. And again, it has to be, that's kind of the tactical ways now that there's this place to put it.
Mm-hmm.
But the culture shift has to happen of like both on the product side that someone has to be responsible and own making sure that those product rules are updated. Preferably, they should be updated before design is even done, because the designer has to consider those rules. And I've seen tons of rework in the design phase, and then same even in the technical design phase. So the earlier you kind of have that, and it needs to be again worked with the engineers. It shouldn't be just solely the responsibility of the product manager, because if
Mm-hmm.
if leading up to that point, a lot of your rules have been, the code is the source of truth, that you'll need an engineer to tell you what is the reality today. You'll have to talk to
Mm.
customers to see if you make this change, what's the best approach. So there's a lot of steps in there,
Well,
but the internal product book is kind of the anchor.
the as you lay it out, this to me this screams like a problem that AI would actually be pretty good at. Of, hey, tell me, look at my code base. Tell me the emergent rules around this configuration thing, and it would look at everywhere, hopefully that this is used, and say, okay, well, you got this and that, and then you could ask it to tell you inconsistencies in the code, and you could then start working to do it. And also, theoretically, you could have a step in your process of, hey, check this work against the rule book and see if I've done anything that violates the rules.
That would be cool to have like a check at some point. Like I can imagine a PR check that runs. It's like, did you accidentally change any of the base rules or introduce new sets?
Mm-hmm.
That would be neat. Like when I follow up on the PR itself,
right?
That runs like in a pipeline to check against latest.
Right. There are a lot of agents now, that AI agents that will check your pull requests, so that if you went through the effort of developing this internal rulebook, you could definitely have the AI check and kick out of, hey, this seems like a contradiction.
Yeah, you can also have it on the kind of the flip side of that. You can feed that book to an AI and say, hey, tell me what are the rules for XYZ thing. And that can become like now a internal search base for, engineers, but also for product. So if imagine cross-team product communication about shared modules. It's right in the product book, and you can talk to the AI to kind of get answers out of it. Because over time, these things like grow. There's multiple versions. Some of them are like very detailed and not necessarily technical, but like mathematical. Like think of like formulas. How do you do reporting? All of those things I've seen are like the best things to put in first. So if you're like, what should I start with? To me, that's what you start with, is any of the like formulas that your company uses. Because in my opinion, you should be able to do all of the reporting. You should be able to take the data out of the database and like just do the reporting without the software, if you know the formulas that are used. And so that's how you can then start to validate the software works how you intend that it works, even if you're non-technical. That's what I like about it.
I've done so many reporting bugs where different reports use slightly different versions of the formulas.
Yeah, or time zone comes into play, or like how do you decide how weeks are calculated, which seems like a small detail, but Monday to Sunday and Sunday to
Saturday
is a different week set. So
it is.
Fees, part calculations, all of that stuff I found to be really helpful to have in there. Login methods, these are all kind of examples of like sections I think you could have in your product book.
Okay. So it seems like product book can be very emergent now that we have AI. Of, you can ask the AI, hey, what are the rules today? Or what can you make out of the rules? And then someone can review it and agree or disagree. And then you can also have AI tell you where you've deviated from the theoretical rules. And then it's the kind of thing that would get better over time, especially if you started using a pull request agent, because it would catch these deviations.
Yeah, and you can even use AI to help like generate some of these rules. So I like to use AI as like a devil's advocate and like show me things that I'm missing. If what are the other perspectives to this that I'm not seeing, and that can kind of help generate some of those other business rules that you may not, things that you and your team may feel like are just so obvious you don't even think about it. That's probably the stuff that needs to be documented for the incoming team.
All right. No. Any other thoughts?
Not from
That's
me.
it on my side.
Thank you all for listening. I'm Jeffrey Sherman.
Dustin Rea.
And I'm Isaac Askew, and this is Never Rewrite.